Please try and frame your question within 1 minute. And please direct that question to the person that you might like to have answer that, if you would.
My question's for Tom Huffaker. Petroleum companies receive capital from securities offerings and from private venture capital. The goal of investors and corporations is to maximize profit. How do you maximize profit? Well, there's lots of ways, but a major way is to cut costs and to cut corners. Many conservation and stewardship initiatives cannot be monetized into immediate profit, read dollars and cents. How do you reconcile the goal of petroleum companies to maximize profits now or next quarter with the goals of conservation, which often cannot be calculated into immediate dollar value profit, but can have a beneficial non-monetary value for future generations?
Thanks. Great question. I think obviously it applies really to almost any business in almost any sector, but maybe in a lot of people's minds it applies maybe in almost an exaggerated way to the oil and gas sector. I think there are a number of factors, at a maybe perhaps less charitable level to ourselves. Obviously, there are rules and regulations and laws, and we're obligated to comply with the rules and regulations and laws. I think, fortunately, we have an ethic that goes further than that and embraces the idea to have a long-term high standard. This relates to what we refer to as our social license to do business. If we don't operate on that higher bar, our very ability to perform our businesses and supply the essential energy services that people need will be greatly hampered. We embrace that and recognize that in the modern democratic society you can't operate long term if you are indifferent to these things. And finally, I would say I think we have a lot of leaders in the industry who have a lot of vision, and of course they have to respond to shareholders on a quarterly basis. But I think a lot of them are held in the kind of high respect that allows them to take a longer term view of things and look a little further over the horizon at their desire to be able to return goods to their shareholders, to their communities, and to the country on a much longer term basis than that, which ultimately I suppose is long-term profit driven, which is not a bad thing. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead. Before you ask, I'm going to just ask Tom one more question. And it relates rather to the corporate scenarios. I noticed that in your presentation you didn't talk about tailings ponds, probably because I cut you off. But and also I have some issues on some of the statistics, but those are things you and I will talk about later. I got another question. CAP is really effective in using public relations tactics to make the interests of its members well known to political leaders and to the public too. I've seen the new CAP presentations several times in the last 2 months, and one of the things I think you do well is you repeat, you repeat, you repeat. I wonder if you have advice regarding the sustainability and stewardship agenda on how it ought to undertake its public relations advancing these ideas. Can you tell us from what you know in CAP what this group might do?
Bob, I would love if you would come in our boardroom and tell our board that we are doing that great a job on the PR side. Some of them are not as absolutely convinced that we are as fabulous as you might have made us sound. We work very, very hard at it, obviously, and we have a point of view and we try to be consistent. I personally have I've worked for a number of politicians over the years, and one of the messages I always got from them, and I think we heard it from Mr. Manning this morning, is one, this point that Preston makes very, very well on brevity and absorbability, and I think the other one that I always got from the politicians I worked for is repetition, repetition, repetition. Former Ambassador Salucci, who had been a governor, I was working for him. He was fond of saying to his staff, if you haven't repeated a message till you were absolutely sick and tired of it, you haven't even gotten started. And yes, you will see the 3E message that I started with constantly through CAP presentations. It has the virtue also of being something we believe in, which I think is terribly important in any message. And no, I didn't talk about tailings ponds. I'd be happy to talk about tailings ponds. Probably as the Albertans in the room know, the provincial government has just announced new rules and regs on tailings ponds, which are more demanding that we're going to have to comply with. We have a bunch of technologies out there that we are very hopeful are going to move us beyond tailings ponds entirely in the coming years. And we're going to make progress on reclaiming tailings ponds that have already been used. And I wish I knew what used to be under those pictures I showed you. But those pictures actually were of that land with the buffalo on it, et cetera. Those were former mining pits. So that we've come quite a ways in reclaiming those areas.
Would you like to go ahead?
Yes. Alan Gardner from SALTS. Question for the lady from the Canadian Wildlife Service mainly. Related to the Habitat Stewardship Program, and it has to do with stewardship, and it has to do with a broader question, and that is we work with our organization with a lot of people who work on the land. And my contact with the Habitat Stewardship Program is that if you are looking for assistance, then are you in a crisis? And it comes down to the issue that people who have done a good job of stewardship are patted on the back and we applaud their stewardship, but you're on your own. But if we have somebody who's done a poor job of stewardship, then the government is quite happy to jump up and fund them to make it better. So the question comes down to the whole issue to some extent of ecological services or payment of the same, and the ALUS program is part of that. And that is how does the Habitat Stewardship Program, or would you like to comment on the issue of how do we reward those agricultural producers who have done a good job of stewardship, rather than leaving them to fend on their own and helping the people who have done poor decisions? It's sort of like the GM question. Should we be looking at the people who have done a good job of business, or should we be bailing out the people who have done a bad job? How does that relate to ecology and environment and funding? Thank you.
Okay, and you want that directed at Virginia, is that correct?
Yes, please.
Yeah, please.
So, good question. It is a challenge always when you have a funding program. You set out your targets, you set out what it is you are seeking to achieve with that particular program. In the case of the Habitat Stewardship Program, it's related to species at risk primarily. And so you have to align the projects that you seek to fund through that program with your target, which is, in this case, ensuring that we have habitat for species at risk. And there's an interesting correlation between the land that has, shall we say, been close to development and the presence of species at risk. So I take your point. I come back to what is the purpose of the program. It's there to support stewardship actions that will help sustain and improve the recovery of our species at risk. So that's that. As it relates to rewarding good stewardship practices, I believe that through the agricultural policy framework, the previous one, there had been some work done in that regard. Some of the work that's done through the NAWAMP program that is funded and we deal with through joint ventures and so on, certainly I think supports good stewardship efforts that are on the land. I know last summer when I was out in the prairies and I was shown some of the very interesting innovative work that was being done, I could see that it was being rewarded. Now, that's a step different from every good steward on the land who is being financially rewarded. And I do think we need to be careful when we start thinking about going down that path that we do not set up a system whereby stewardship only happens when we pay for it, because I think we all understand that it takes a lot of actions by a lot of actors across the landscape, and if we I think, run the risk of building a system that will create inherent disincentives for stewardship, which by its nature is to some extent founded on the voluntary sector. The last point I will just make, I did see some of the early work around the ALICE efforts and other programs that are trying to put a cost around ecological goods and services, and I do think it's promising. I think it's early days, though, to line it up to a funding program.